Welcome, Westside family, and anyone else joining us in our study of church history. Tonight, we're going to look at early church beliefs that were false. One of the key ones that developed was infant baptism, and we want to see how that came about. As anyone today is aware of mainstream Christianity, mainline Christianity, if we are talking about Roman Catholicism, they practice infant baptism. Mainline Protestantism, when you think of the Presbyterian Church and Methodist, Lutheran, the Anglican or Episcopal Church in America, all practice infant baptism. If you go to the Greek Orthodox Church, you would see the same thing. So widely practiced in Christianity in the Western world and in the Eastern world as well. And so we need to see how it developed because it is not a biblical doctrine. And so we want to see how the rise, it gave rise to it in those first centuries and has stayed put through all the centuries since. Infants and children in the Bible are incapable of sinning. It puts them in a category of innocence, and that is that they know not the difference between what is right, wrong, sin. And I think intuitively we understand that about children. Even our legal code recognizes that a minor is not to be tried in a court of law on the same basis as one that we would say is in the majority. There's a point in there where obviously, and here we're talking even later in age, where someone recognizes that were a 10 or 11-year-old to say strike someone with a hammer and seriously injure them or even kill them is not the same as somebody who is 20 years old and does that. And so intuitively, I think we recognize that the capacity to commit evil and terrible sin is just not found in children and babies for sure. Children, at what age do we call that the age of accountability? Even in our world, in the legal world, would recognize that there is a distinction. And the Bible clearly points that out. A number of passages, Matthew chapter 18, beginning at verse 1, at that time the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, "Assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted," that is, turn again, "and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." And so how could someone enter the kingdom of heaven as full of sin, full of sins that have not been forgiven? Just would seem utterly incompatible with what the New Testament teaches. So a child is not capable of that. He said you have to become like them. In chapter 19 at verse 13 and 14, the little children were brought to him that he might put his hands on them and pray. But the disciples rebuked them. But Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." So the spiritual realm of which adults will come to belong in some way has to operate on the basis of how children stand before God. And so they stand before God in a state of innocence. When Paul is making his argument in Romans, the 9th chapter, turn over there and look with me, and he is talking about God's right to choose, to elect someone over another, to make that choice, that God has the right to do that. At verse 10 and 11, of this chapter, it says, "And not only this, but when Rebekah, who also conceived by one man, even our father Isaac, for the children," that's Esau and Jacob, "for the children not yet being born," all right, they're fetuses, "nor," listen to him, "having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him who calls." That God, chose Jacob the younger, which was not primogeniture. That was to be the way it normally was, that the oldest would be selected, but God selected the younger. And his argument's based on a whole lot of things that are in this passage. But all I want you to center on is that he makes that comment about the babies when they were in the womb. They have not done good or evil. They were incapable of doing good or evil, because all children simply do not have the capacity to sin. In Ezekiel 18, one of the prime passages used to disprove hereditary sin, or that we are corrupted by the original sin of Adam, we inherit that and therefore become guilty. All are guilty in Adam. Clearly, the Bible disputes that in Ezekiel 18 and verse 20 by saying, "The soul who sins shall die." You do not die. In other words, babies are to be baptized because they need forgiveness of sins that they have inherited from Adam. And that's going to become a full-blown doctrine by the time of the 5th century in Augustine, the theologian. But God simply says, the truth is, the soul that sins, you have to be capable of sinning. We've already seen that Jacob and Esau were not capable of sinning as infants in the womb. So they could not be inheriting the sin of Adam. The soul that sins dies, not a baby. A baby is not in need of being forgiven, not in need of being baptized. The Son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the Father, nor the Father suffer for the iniquity of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. So the soul that sins, the soul that does right, will, of course, be judged for that righteousness. The soul that sins will be judged for that sin. Look in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 20. And in this passage, the Apostle Paul says, "Brethren, do not be children in understanding. However, in malice be babes, but in understanding be mature." Well, his argument in this chapter, it is that you're to quit acting like you're children because you're adults, and you're to act as Christ, full-grown sons and daughters. But in malice, it is in the capability of having evil come out of us, he says, is babes, because babes are not capable of sinning. They do not sin. Therefore, they're in a state of innocence, and that's his argument. And then finally, a statement that is made about Jesus in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14 through 16. Famous passage, verse 14. "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign." This is the King Ahaz of Judah. "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel," that meaning God with us. And that's quoted in Matthew when Jesus was born. Now look at verse 15 and 16. "He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good." Remember, that wasn't possible for Esau and Jacob. And the same is true when Jesus took on flesh, when God became man. There came a point when, as a human being, he knew to refuse the evil and choose good. Now, folks, I can't explain about God and human being melded, but to understand his argument about humanity. "For before the boy," verse 16, "knows how," the boy, all right, so somewhere in childhood, knows how to refuse the evil, or maybe we say early teens, somewhere in there, as we talk about the age of accountability, who knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. That simply is not possible for a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old. It's simply not possible for a baby that's just been born. So the scriptures clearly teach that babies are incapable of sinning, that children are incapable of sinning. They are thus in a state of innocence. And so let's begin to look then at what the early writers of the 2nd century believed. All right. The Epistle of Barnabas, we looked at this last week. It is a pseudonym for Paul's companion. It was not authored by Barnabas. It was written much later, AD 80 to 120. Most likely Barnabas, just like Paul, has died by then. And most likely written in Alexandria in the 2nd century, which Barnabas would have clearly been dead. So it's just a pseudonym. It is one of the 10 or so authors that are known as the Apostolic Fathers. Doesn't mean that they were apostles. It just means that they were the ones who early on, and the writings that were uninspired, began to form the believers, okay, the 2nd century. So they were not the companions of the apostles, but 2nd century disciples. So the Epistle of Barnabas says this at 6:11. Since he renewed us in the forgiveness of sins, he made us into another image so as to have the soul of children. Does that sound like Matthew 18 that we looked at a moment ago in 19? As if he were indeed refashioning us to become like children to enter the kingdom of heaven. So this clearly, very early on, makes the statement that obviously children are not full of sin, as others would argue later on. All right, The Shepherd of Hermas, in an apocalyptic book written from Rome in the first half of the second century, somewhere from 100 to 160. Again, what we said about the Apostolic Fathers. So I'll give you a map here that you're going to see a lot of names, and we're going to be circling them as we round the Mediterranean and look at what all the church fathers believed widely. Okay, we're talking about a huge area and mass of land, and we're thinking about what they believed in different places. So the Shepherd of Hermas says, those who believed are such as these. They are like innocent infants, in whose heart no wickedness enters, saying exactly what we studied in the New Testament, and who do not know what evil is, but always remain in innocence. As many of you then who will continue and be as infants with no wickedness, remember what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 14:20, will be more honored than all others, for all infants are honored before God and are in the first rank before him, because they are incapable of sinning and therefore stand innocent in his sight. All right, a man by the name of Aristides or Aristides was an Athenian philosopher. We never hear about a church being in Athens. A few followed Paul, remember, in the book of Acts. But he becomes a Christian, and he becomes one of the apologists. All right, he presented his apology to the Emperor Hadrian, so very early on, one of the very early apologists in AD 124. In fact, a full copy of his manuscript was not discovered until 1889. It was known to exist by the other writers that came, particularly Eusebius at the beginning of the 3rd century, or 4th century, I'm sorry. In 1889, though, a Syriac version, Aramaic, was discovered at St. Catherine's Monastery, the traditional Mount Sinai that's in the peninsula that belongs to Egypt today. Okay, so this is where Aristides or Aristides is in Athens. We're going to see another guy right above that, Athenagoras. Again, you see Athens in his name. Again, we're just looking at the thinking of Christians in those early centuries. All right, so Aristides says, the bottom quote, and when a child has been born to one of them, as he's giving his defense to Hadrian, Christians, they give thanks to God. And if it should die as an infant, they give thanks the more because it has departed life sinless. So very clearly teaching what the New Testament taught that we've already looked at. Babies, infants were incapable of sinning, departed the life sinless if it died. All right, we showed Athenagoras a minute ago. He was an apologist who delivered in AD 177, again, to an emperor, to Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a plea for the Christians, refuting the pagan charges against Christians. He also wrote another tract called On the Resurrection of the Dead. So remember again, Athenagoras is in Athens that we've circled there. All right, here's his quote at the bottom. Although all human beings who die are resurrected, not all those resurrected are judged. All right, so he's talking about babies. Babies and children that die are going to be resurrected. If justice and the judgment were the only cause of the resurrection, it would follow, of course, that those who have not sinned nor done good, namely quite young children, would not be resurrected. If it was only for judgment, rather that there'll be some raised who are raised in absolute innocence. They did not. They're not going to pass through the judgment in the sense that God is going to look at their works, that our works do follow us, and that we will be judged according to our works. They were incapable of doing good or evil, and that's a point that is made by Athenagoras. All right, Irenaeus, we've seen him before. He was Bishop of Lyon in Gaul. Gaul is ancient France. He was a student of Polycarp, so very own Bishop of Smyrna, a contemporary. Polycarp was a contemporary of the apostles. And Irenaeus wrote against heresies that's dated about 180. So here circled is Gaul, and so we know that as modern France, Lyon, which was a seat, an important seat there. All right, the bottom quote, Who were those who were saved and received the inheritance? He asked. Those who believed in God and kept their love for him, such as Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun, and innocent children who have no sense of evil. Who are those now who are saved and receive eternal life? Is it not those who love God and believe his promises and in malice have become little children? That quote again out of 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 20. So again, children have no understanding of right or wrong. They are in a state of innocence. He goes on to say, it is clear that in the late, I'm sorry, this is a quote that comes from Davidson about these guys that we've just read. Sorry about that. This is a different quote. It is clear that in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, so we're talking about in the 180s, that we just read, and in the early 3rd centuries, we're going to be into 225 or so, 230 and 40. In the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, infants were being baptized, and that a system of adults acting as sponsors was already in operation in these places. It is equally incontrovertible that this practice increased greatly over subsequent generations and received express theological justification from a number of Christian leaders. But what we're going to find out is that the practice preceded the theological justification, that they first were doing it and then they go to the Bible to force a conclusion, all right, to make the Bible say what they want it to say. He goes on to say, Evor Davidson in Baker's History, Volume 1 of the Church, the practice of baptizing very small children or babies was undoubtedly opposed by some from the start. And we're going to see some of that in a minute in quotes from these guys. So it was not something that was just accepted. Again, notice what he says. It was undoubtedly opposed by some from the very start of people baptizing babies. But clearly by the end of the 2nd century, late into it, and early 3rd centuries, we see examples of babies being baptized. All right, one of these guys that opposed it is Tertullian. Remember, Tertullian became known as the Latin church father because 31 of his works have survived, something like I think is 31, in Latin. He was a very educated man. Lived in the city of Carthage in North Africa in the Roman province that was called North Africa. All right, so Tertullian is the earliest incontestable witness to infant baptism. So he, circa born 150, dies around 215, I believe, if I'm reading that right. He's the earliest incontestable witness to infant baptism, but it is noticeable that he also opposes the practice. In his tract on baptism, he is significant for its opposition to the baptism of infants. It offers the earliest clear evidence, Davidson says, that this practice was taking place, but in the same breath, the earliest indication of controversy about it. So again, we need to understand that it was not accepted, even by somebody as great as Tertullian was. All right, another man, Hippolytus, again from 170 to 236. He was a presbyter. Remember that they were taking a lesser role, that was the elders, taking a lesser role to the bishop. In Rome, he opposed the bishops Zephyrinus and Callistus over the readmission of adulterers and apostates during the time when persecution would happen into the church. And he was elected as a rival bishop in Rome. So there have been times that have happened like that. He was martyred. There's a French altarpiece there in 1225 to 1250, shows horses being attached to his limbs by ropes, and then they were galloped in opposite directions. Just how gruesome that would have been. But he died as a martyr. All right, so his quote, "And they shall baptize the little children first, and if they can answer for themselves, let them answer. But if they cannot, let their parents answer or someone from the family." And that is a practice that goes on to this day, that the parents answer for the infant in these mainline Catholic and Protestant denominations. And so early on we see that Hippolytus lived in that late 2nd century, early 3rd century that it was being practiced. All right, Origen, we've covered him before. He was a very prominent theologian, and again writes in the latter part of the 2nd century into he dies in the mid 3rd century. Prominent Alexandrian, that's Egypt, theologian, a prolific writer, even founded a school as far away as Caesarea, around into Palestine, as we would say. All right, so here's where normally we associate Origen, is in Alexandria, which was in Egypt. All right, the bottom there. I take this occasion to discuss something which our brothers often inquire about. Infants are baptized for the remission of sins. Of what kinds? Or when did they sin? All right, so he clearly understands that infants do not sin, yet baptism is for the remission of sins. Remember, we looked at that last week, and we're going to see even in these quotes that they accept that. But so if baptism is for the remission of sins and infants are baptized, then what about sin? But since no one is exempt from stain, all right, that's going to be different from saying they sinned. One removes the stain by the mystery of baptism. For this reason, infants are also baptized. In other words, being born in the human race, and it's not exactly the idea that will be developed of inheriting the guilt of Adam, but it's coming closer to that. And I'll let you do your own study if you want to go into more detail, but I just trust me that the idea of stain here is not saying exactly what will come to be argued when it's full blown. The doctrine of original sin, one of the great tenets of Calvinism. In fact, the very first tenet of Calvinism, total hereditary depravity. So we inherited that guilt from Adam. Origen goes on to say, for this also the church has a tradition from the apostles to give baptism even to infants. Where in this book did Origen find that? There is no place in this book where infants are to be baptized. You always have adult candidates because they had to be able to believe. They had to be able to confess with their mouth, not have somebody else confess it for them. They had to be able to repent. You never see. All the examples in the book of Acts are adults, are people that are full grown who know they have sinned, who can say, men and brethren, what have we done on the day of Pentecost? And so clearly he is just utterly wrong by saying that. It never came down from the apostles. But notice they're beginning to try to find some kind of justification for it. For they to whom the secrets of the divine mysteries were given knew that there is in all persons the natural stains of sins, which must be washed away by the water. Now he's using biblical terms that we've seen both in what the Bible teaches and what they actually stated in our study last week, it forgives sins. Baptism forgives sins. So washed away by the water and the Spirit. On account of these stains, the body itself is called the body of sin. But they're not going to come out and say a baby sins. They know that that's not possible. They're still holding to that, but they've already accepted the practice. The practice is ongoing. Now, not all of them. Tertullian, remember, the same time period, is not accepting it. So there is a battle going on around that greater Mediterranean world. But Origen has accepted it. So here's a couple of verses he gives for that. These verses, Psalms 51:5 and Job 14:4, may be adduced. Bring them out, he says, when it is asked, why, since the baptism of the church is given for the remission of sins. Remember, that's what the Bible teaches, and they were still believing that baptism forgave sins, was for the remission of sins. Baptism, according to the practice of the church, is given even to infants. Since indeed, if there is in infants nothing which ought to pertain to forgiveness and mercy, the grace of baptism would be superfluous. Why baptize infants if there is no sin? But they will not say, they'll call it stain, but they're not going to say. Now he's coming closer here by saying ought to pertain to forgiveness and mercy. All right. Now let's look at those passages, because often as far back as Origen, Psalms 51:5 is used. If you deal with somebody today who's going to argue for baptizing infants, they're going to use Psalms 51:5. So let's look at that. David exclaims there, behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. And they're going to say, see, that says you're born in sin. You were born in iniquity. Well, let's make some thoughts about that. First of all, we need to understand that when you're dealing with poetic passages, when you're dealing with poetry, Hebrew poetry in Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, all that's called the wisdom literature, and sometimes to categorize it, as we would say, poetry, that it has poetic affirmation. In other words, we're dealing with hyperbole. We're dealing with language that suggests relatively speaking, that the bulk of one's life is characterized by sin. Now, the passage is not literally affirming that infants are conceived in sin and birthed in iniquity. If babies are actual sinners from the point of conception, that is, that in their mother's womb they're sinners, then these denominations need to practice fetal baptism. Some do. The Roman Catholic Church occasionally does that. Most time it's sprinkling after. But again, if in the womb they're in sin, then they need to start then, and they don't do that. They're not consistent in what they say. But consider a parallel from the book of Job. Again, part of the wisdom literature, so poetic language. In defending himself against the false charge that he had neglected the needy, the godly patriarch Job affirmed, quote, "From my youth the orphan grew up with me as a father, and the widow have I guided from my mother's womb." Job 31:18. Does that sound really familiar to David's phrase? "And in sin my mother conceived me, I was brought forth in iniquity." All right, so does anybody literally believe that the moment that Job was born, I guided from my mother's womb? The moment I was born, I started guiding widows. You know that's not literally possible. It's just hyperbole, right? It's just poetic reference to it. So David is basically saying, the bulk of my life is spent in sin, okay? Now the other passage, Job 14:4, and again, to go back to David, because of David knew to choose right and wrong, to go back to the passages that uses the Bible's language. All right, in Job 14, verse 1, it says, "Man," you know this phrase very well, "man who is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble." Now, verse 4, then, it says, "Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? There is not one." In other words, a mother does have sin. She's full grown. How can you bring a clean thing, a baby, out of an unclean thing? Now, once again, it is poetic language. It is hyperbole. All right, it's not saying literally. We've already seen literal passages. Romans 9, Paul saying that Esau and Jacob did not know how to choose good or evil in the womb. We've already seen how you have to become like a little child to enter the kingdom of heaven. We've read all of these passages that are speaking literally. Okay, so when we're dealing with passages like out of the book of Job and the book of Psalms, we have to remember that they are poetic, and that language has to be dealt with. It's not always talking in literal terms, and we need to see that. Yes. Are we born into a world that sin dominates it? We grow up around people that are sinners. Do we learn early on watching what they do to make mistakes that are going to be similar about them? But that will be when we're able to choose. There's somewhere where we cross that line where God knows that we're able to choose between right and wrong. And sometimes we call that the age of accountability. And only God knows that. All right, but babies and children and whatever time period that is, to what time period they reach what maybe we call the age of accountability, God alone knows. Before that, they are innocent. They cannot sin. All right, so Everett Ferguson points this out in his book, Early Christians Speak. Origen affords evidence that the practice of infant baptism came before the theological justification. They didn't go to the Bible and see the Bible commanded to baptize children because it's not in this book. Only adults who can confess Jesus, who can repent, can believe. The sequence was infant baptism, then the doctrine of infant sinfulness. That's what we're seeing by the stain and not really calling it sin. And not a doctrine of original sin, that is, inheriting corruption from Adam, total hereditary depravity, leading to the practice of infant baptism. The reasons for baptizing a child were being discussed. The child did not have sins of his own. Origen's answer was that a stain attaches to birth. All right, there's some more quote there, and if you have it on there, I'll just let you read it on the sheets that I gave you. But basically, that's where I wanted to end. Origen's answer was a stain attaches, so we have to do something about it. But you're not finding that in the Bible. You're finding it they were practicing it and they wanted to try to prove it somehow. All right, Cyprian, who was bishop of Carthage, where Tertullian was from, was martyred by Valerian. We looked at that when we were thinking about all the persecutions. And here is where Cyprian was from, where Tertullian was from. And so he says, and remember, now we come to Cyprian dying in the middle of the 3rd century. If when forgiveness of sins is granted even to the worst transgressors, and if no one is held back from baptism, how much less ought an infant to be held back, who having been born recently has not sinned, except in that being born physically according to Adam, the infant has contracted the contagion of the ancient death by its first birth, and understanding baptism would be the second birth. The sins remitted to it are not its own, but those of another. Did Ezekiel contradict that? Did the Word of God say, the soul that sins shall die? You'll not suffer for the sins of your father. In other words, that you will be held accountable for the sins of your fathers. And neither the son for, either way, the righteousness or you read that chapter, the soul that sins dies. You don't suffer judgment of sin for that was done by another. And yet, clearly Cyprian is progressing the thought where we're getting closer and closer to this idea of original sin that Augustine, or Augustine, however you want to pronounce it, I've heard it both ways, will come along in the early 5th century and will, in the 400s, will absolutely, and that will stand. Calvinism will come down to our day. Almost every mainline denomination, Roman Catholicism, practice infant baptism based on the doctrine of original sin, of total hereditary depravity. All right, Cyprian Everett Ferguson said is the first clear theological exponent of the baptism of newborn babes. His letter conveys an answer of the North African bishops to an inquiry whether infant baptism should be given on the 8th day, like they were circumcised in the Old Testament. The unanimous reply indicates a long-standing and generally accepted practice. Tertullian's opposition had been put down. Origen and Cyprian, again, both in that African continent, were both reasoning from the practice to the doctrine, offering a theological justification for a practice that had come to be accepted. They were responding to questions raised by the anomaly of baptizing infants, since infants don't have sin. They clearly understood that, and yet we're baptizing them, so why? And so they had to come up with this idea of the stain, and then it just progressed until it becomes the full-grown total hereditary depravity. And so that leads us to this idea of Augustine or Augustine. As infant baptism became even more general, and since baptism was uniformly regarded as administered for the forgiveness of sins, the practice of infant baptism became a decisive argument for the doctrine of original sin. The Pelagian controversy, right? A man by the name of Pelagius come along that would absolutely refute the idea of Augustine. But Augustine would be the one that won out in church history, and that's why all these denominations accept, and Calvinism accepts, total hereditary depravity. But you and I would be, if you want to talk about it from the standpoint of church history, Pelagians, all right? The opposite of that. We believe the Bible does not teach total hereditary depravity. The Pelagian controversy at the beginning of the 5th century, in the 400s, when Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, secured the triumph of the doctrine of original sin, one of his main arguments was infant baptism, which had become such an established thing that Pelagius, who denied original sin, could not deny the appropriateness of baptizing children. Everybody said we're baptizing children. And therefore, if that became your argument, Pelagius just had to give in, basically, because so many people were baptizing children. They had accepted it. But as we've already seen, they were doing the practice, and not because the Bible stated it. The Bible had it. All right, so you come to the time we live in. I wanted to give you a quote out of H.A.W. Meyer. Some of you may recognize him. He wrote a very learned commentary on the whole New Testament. This one is out of the book of Acts. I have the 1979 reprint in my library of the original Funk and Wagnall's 1884 edition. So it's printed exactly like it was in 1884. And here's his quote. Therefore, the baptism of the children of Christians, of which no trace is found in the New Testament. Now, I want you to point out also, Meyer is not a New Testament Christian from the standpoint of following what we have come to believe, all right, about baptism and all kinds of things that we could talk about. He's not a member of the Church of Christ, okay? So that's what I want you to see. But he is clearly an honest man looking at the scriptures. He says, therefore, the baptism of the children of Christians, of which no trace is found in the New Testament, is not to be held as an apostolic ordinance. Remember, Origen said it's come down from the apostles. Clearly, Meyer's saying, where do you find that in the New Testament? As indeed it encountered early and long resistance. But it is an institution of the church, and he means by that this Catholic Christianity of them all coming together and these synods and councils that would eventually just make it firm doctrine that had to be opposed later. It was an institution of the later church, not of the inspired writers of the New Testament, which gradually arose in post-apostolic, following the apostle times, not certainly attested before Tertullian, and by him still decidedly opposed. Remember, he was the one we saw that opposed it. And although already defended by Cyprian, only becoming general after the time of Augustine. So I wanted you to see that and how it developed, how it persists our times, how important the early centuries are, and how the doctrines can continue through time, even though they are false doctrines and they are not taught in the New Testament. All right. Thank you for listening to our study today, and we look forward to continuing with you next week when we'll look at the Council of Nicaea, which is a very, very important council that occurs in the early part of the 4th century.